Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Sci-Fi Moon Visions, produced by the Cultural Considerations Working Group of the Moon Village Association. My name is Remo Rapetti, and I am co-chair of this working group. As it happened with many other people, sci-fi was also the first opportunity for me to become interested in space exploration. When I was a young man, I devoured the novels by Ray Bradbury, Isaac Asimov, Clifford Mack, Arthur C. Clarke, and many other writers. We all know that science fiction, with books, cartoons, and movies, played a fundamental role in preparing humanity, especially in the United States, to accept the idea of investing a great amount of money in scientific and technological research with the aim of taking man to the moon for the first time. When von Braun at the time wrote, "Thousands of young people dream of a world in which the power of missiles no longer has secrets," already imagining being able to circumnavigate the Earth aboard spaceships, land on the moon, and converse in a familiar manner with the inhabitants of Mars. The ease with which comic book heroes already do all this leaves them in no doubt that such a future is very close. Therefore, we have chosen today to focus on this topic, and we have invited two outstanding personalities to talk about it. Christopher Kokinos is a very well-known writer. He recently wrote a book about the moon, Still as Bright, an illuminating history of the moon from antiquity to tomorrow. It's a beautiful book that we have presented in a webinar some time ago. The book outlines the long-lasting relationship of humanity with our satellite. Erika Nesvold is the author of another very interesting book on space issues, Of Earth, Ethical Questions and Quandaries for Living in Outer Space. And she is also co-editor of Reclaiming Space, Progressive and Multicultural Visions of Space Exploration. In this book, a number of authors ask, what would exploration be like if we prioritized or even simply acknowledged the perspectives and value systems of individuals who are disabled, aren't white, aren't male, or aren't characteristically Western in their values? But now let's go to the presentations. Just let me remind that attendees can ask questions or add comments via the chat button, and that after the presentations, Lisa Pettibone, co-chair of this working group, will run a Q&A session. Christopher Kokinos will start with this presentation with the title Long Before Rockets, Imagination's Voyages to the Moon. Chris, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm making sure there. Are the slides visible?
Yes.
Is that okay? And I'm cutting off a little bit. Next time I do this, I'll change the the PowerPoint design. But in any case, I want to thank Remo so much for all the work he does with the Cultural Considerations Working Group and the Moon Village Association, and Lisa as co-chair. We've become colleagues and friends, and Erica, thank you so much for joining us as well. I want to put in a plug for Erica's organization. Well, it's not her organization, but she helps to shepherd a group called the Just Space Alliance. which I recommend you take a look at if you're interested. And thank you so much to Glafki for the technical support behind the scenes. So um, I changed the title a little bit. Long before Rockets was the original title, but I actually move into the space age a little bit before I'll hand the baton over to Erica. I'm going to talk here about Imagination's voyages to the moon, Lucian to Ballard. So from the second century AD to 1985. So I have a lot to cover. I promise to try to keep it crisp and I'll try to talk for about 25 minutes or so. So I will be taking us then from ancient times to the sort of space age era, post Apollo, and hit some highlights along the way. I don't have time to talk about the folkloric and especially non-Western versions and visions of lunar voyages. I think that really ought to be another webinar. And we could have, I mean, we could have multiple sessions about the global cultural sense of the lunar imaginary and travels to the moon, you know, whether spiritual or physical. So here we'll focus on this sort of Western canon, the kind of proto science fiction and science fiction that Remo was talking about. So as we return to the moon with Artemis, I think we need to return to these imaginary voyages. These are leaps of creative vision. They're not just nostalgic trifles, although they can be fun as nostalgic trifles. They do tell us about ourselves and our attitudes toward places. And that to me is a foundation for helping us to think about policy. I don't think anybody who is interested in situ resource utilization is necessarily reading Lucian's true story, the first lunar voyage from the second century AD, but there are things there that we can learn from. So and it turns out some of these are a lot of fun as well. So I'll be drawing on my book and some other sources that I'll share at the end if you're interested. And I just want to say too that there are some important themes here. So the first one is that the moon seems a lot more appealing if it has life on it. Okay. And so we'll be talking a little bit about this notion of extraterrestrial life because the moon was the first place where we projected that. And it's also clear that the human presence on the moon can be ennobling, but a lot of these writers working in kind of proto science fiction or satire, they look at it as a chance to investigate and interrogate usually our shortcomings, our foibles, and indeed also our relationship to economy and government and how we relate to each other. What's largely missing from this, we'll get a little bit from Jules Verne, is the moon itself as this beautiful object in the sky. So, ancients had imagined life in the sky, and though he was cautious on the question, Galileo, after he looks through his telescope in 1609 and sees the moon is a world with landscape, he gives you know a sort of new energy to those dreams of life in the sky, and so you get visions of lunar gardens and lunar livestock and lunar bat people filling the pages of all kinds of books, philosophical, fictional, and scientific. And it turns out, you know, those genres tend to blur. And this desire for Selenites, Selene, right, the moon goddess, so Selenites, really, of course, wasn't a matter of doing science in the terms that we understand it today. It was hope, it was longing. There was, as you will see, at least in one case, some a couple of cases, you know, sort of thinking through these issues through logic, but also alloyed with belief and with a problem. And the problem was um, if there are other worlds besides the Earth, what would God do with them? Would they be populated or would they be barren? And the notion quickly came to the fore that of God would not waste a world. So life had to exist on the moon. And this is not just a sort of Western a belief. There's a scholar named Carl Guthke in a really terrific book called The Last Frontier, Imagining Other Worlds from the Copernican Revolution to Modern Science Fiction. He notes that Buddhism accepted and accepts the idea of what is called the plurality of worlds. So when I say that phrase, that was the phrase in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, what we would call, search for extraterrestrial intelligence. The Pythagoreans in ancient Greece believed that the moon and stars were populated by human beings. In the Middle Ages, you have the Chinese philosopher Ting Mu and the European theologian Nicholas of Cusa, all talking about the possibility of inhabited planet worlds. But that becomes the minority view in the Christian tradition derived from Aristotle and Plato, which keeps the human world, Earth, at the center. And so it becomes really controversial in the 18th and 19th century, 17th, 18th, and 19th century, whether or not there's life on other worlds. So um, some of these tales then are projections of life on the moon and are participating in that larger discussion. They are exercises in social commentary. They're often funny. They're satirical. So it's kind of proto-science fiction. And we could talk about definitions of science fiction later if we want to. I don't think anybody would call Lucian's tale science fiction, but it is a kind of proto version of that. So one of the things I also would just say too is that a lot of these tales are relating to two other traditions, and I don't have time to get into this, very deeply. But Thomas More writes Utopia in 1516, and it turns out a lot of the lunar voyages that we imagine, the moon is not only populated, like they're better than us, like they're smarter, they get along. Okay, not the case in Lucian's story, but there is this projection of utopia to the moon, and it's also participating in travel literature, like the opening of the oceans through sailing to quote unquote New World, European discovery of these other lands, and reports that are often quite exaggerated, right, and not necessarily holding true to the accounts of the places where these mariners go. So all of that's kind of combining here. So let's go back to this first proto-science fiction story written in the 2nd century by Lucian, who was from a small town in present-day Syria. He had a hardscrabble life, Lucian. He was probably going to become a stonemason. And then he decided to try something else. He escapes. He gets to the Greek islands and settles on Ionia. He learns how to become a public speaker. He learns Greek. He learns philosophy. And he starts to write tales. He wrote 2 lunar tales. And this one, the most important one, is called A True Story, which of course, the title alone is worth a discussion. And it inspired a long chain of literary descendants, according to the critic James Gunn. So in this story, a storm, and we're going to talk about lunar transportation before rockets, okay, gives the engineers some ideas. But in this case, a ship is hurtled to the moon because of a storm, and the crew finds the surface is inhabited. There are farms, and from there they can look at the Earth, maybe the first, sort of notion of looking at the Earth from outer space, or the first representation of it. So I don't know if the narrator doesn't really have the overview effect, as Frank White calls it, but they can see the Earth. So they get there and they discover that the moon people are at war with the people of the sun. It's entirely unclear why they're so angry with each other, but it is an absurdist tale of combat. We have troops that are made of vultures. There's a horse unit, a cavalry made of salad birds. So these are birds that are covered in lettuce rather than feathers. They have archers riding fleas. The solar troops are also ludicrous. They have cavalry made up of ants. They have archers on huge gnats. And the solar troops, of course, ultimately win, because how can you lose with a bunch of ants and huge gnats? So they set up after their victory, they set up a wall to cut off the moon from sunlight. So I don't know if Stephen Miller might have gotten some ideas from that. Eventually, there's equitable peace, and the narrator is allowed to travel. And this is where we move from the sort of satire of the futility and stupidity of war, which is what that was, to the sort of absurdity of human relations and sexuality. So there are no women on the moon. There are only men. They carry their babies in their calves. The men cut off a testicle planet, and when this tree bears fruit, they have their babies. The men are hatched from them. They use ivory and wooden penises for sex. They don't die of old age. They turn into smoke. They eat only frog. They don't go to the bathroom. They have one toe. They have long beards, and so forth. It's just like, this really comical and absurd description of these men on the moon. So we can read it as that, and it's meant to be funny, but it is also a satire of the relationships among these levels of society, among these men. And so, for example, the poor men wear woven copper, and the rich men wear woven glass. And so there's a commentary of social strata here, not just sexuality. But the most poignant part of Lucian's tale is when he describes he's on the moon, and he describes this well, and there's a mirror placed over the well, and it's pointed at the earth, and they can hear every conversation that's taking place on the earth, and they can see all the sights of the distant earth. I just think that's so beautiful. And that's Lucian. So there is a fair amount of time between when Lucian's story is published in the form it would have been published in the second century AD, and Kepler, Johannes Kepler, the astronomer and author. And it's really a reflection of the fact that then the telescope begins to reveal the moon's potential nature. So a lot of the sort of lunar stories between Kepler's time and Lucian's time, are these folkloric stories that I'm just, for time, I'm just going to have to skip over. But Kepler writes a manuscript that you may have heard of called the Somnium, or the Dream. He writes it and only passes it around privately. This is in 1610. His mother had been suspected as a witch for quite a while, so he was very careful about this manuscript. And in fact, she is arrested in 1620, and Kepler spends a lot of time working to get her out of prison, which is an astonishing thing to have been able to do. She dies not long after he frees her from imprisonment, and he dies himself 10 years later. The book first appears in 1634. And he actually sort of combining lunar observation. He had a camera obscura that he used to form an image of the moon on paper, and he could see the Maria, right? The dark spots, the seas of the moon, as they were thought to be seas. And so they were real. They weren't just, sort of illusions of the atmosphere or eyesight. So he's recognizing, as does Galileo through the telescope, this is an actual place, okay? So he calls the book a dream. The narrator arrives while he's sleeping, of course, the standard sort of cross-planetary travel motif. Edgar Rice Burroughs would use that for John Carter of Mars. And the book then becomes, or this, the manuscript becomes a fairly comprehensive scientific account of the moon. He calls the moon Lavinia. He describes getting there and experiencing the cold of outer space and having trouble breathing, which is fairly prescient. And then up there, he finds that there is air, there are people, there are cultivated farm fields. This cultivation, I know Erica will talk a little bit about mining. I'm sure a lot of the lunar tales involve not extracting rock, but having farms. So sort of perhaps there's recognition of the agricultural domination of the time, the importance of agriculture. And so he describes the geography, and he spends a lot of time describing the physics. So it's not as interesting as Lucian's, a true story, because you get a lot of complicated, discussion of the moon's complicated motions, different environments and different seasons that are suggested by the moon's movements. But it's a short manuscript. It's really important, and he does encounter lunar life. He describes these giant creatures. Giant creatures also a theme or a motif, I should say, for a lot of voyages to the moon. They tend to be much bigger than people on Earth. And again, I think a sort of uh, a commentary, whether conscious or not, about the sort of smallness and pettiness of humanity. So it's not really a tall tale, but it's an interesting speculation of the place itself and the physics that you can appreciate from Earth. Okay. So there are others, and there are a lot of other lunar voyages. So I really, there are multiple tens of them published in English, published in French, in German, in English, in England, and in the United States. Most of these have faded to obscurity, but in my last slide, we'll give you some anthologies where you can take a look at them. So you're seeing some of the ways that you get to the moon. A ship with sails with a gas maybe or dew. Cyrano de Bergerac's narrator wraps a bunch of flasks, a bunch of vials around him filled with dew so he can rise with the dew to the sun. So 4 years after Kepler's book, there's this little sort of mini explosion. An English bishop, interesting, we've got actually two bishops here to talk about from England. Francis Godwin publishes a fictional account of going to the moon, very popular, called The Man in the Moon. And we see that developing perspective in there of sort of a kind of utopian culture on the moon. They're smarter than us. They're happier than us. They don't go to war. The environmental historian Michael Rawson says the book also popularized the idea of the Earth and Moon as a system, as a kind of linked environment. That same year, so I'm talking 1638, another English cleric, a bishop named John Wilkins, who's the first secretary of the Royal Society. So you see that mix of church theology and science and natural history. And he publishes a speculation called A Discourse Concerning a New World, also very popular. You get Cyrano de Bergerac in 1657, and all of these sort of visions are wrapping up also with dreams from people like Roger Bacon and Leonardo da Vinci, right, of human flight. And so one of the things that becomes so appealing is not just the depiction of what a lunar society is going to be like, and again, it tends to be more of a utopian depiction, but also how you get there. And so for anyone who might be an engineer, if you know anybody at Blue Origin or SpaceX, and I know we're looking for alternative versions of the human landing system for Artemis. Um, Dreams get you to the moon, vials of dew, birds. It was unclear where birds went to a lot of Europeans. They didn't know about migration, and so one of the thoughts was they hibernated on the moon. They would fly to the moon. So we just strap a bunch of geese to your ship, and you'll get there, right? Angels, storms. You could attach wings to your body, go by flying chariot. And curiously, though, rockets don't really appear to be a huge mode of transportation in these lunar voyages. Now, I want to take a moment and talk a little bit about um, someone who takes a voyage to the moon, but really just in his imagination. But we need to know this figure, enormously important writer, French writer, Bernard Fontenelle, had a huge impact on French literature and culture in the 17th and 18th century. And so he writes a book in 1686 called Conversations on the Plurality of Worlds. And the first world he imagines that has life on it is the moon. And I'll just pause here for a second. And I went to the chateau in France where he wrote this book, and it was for a different project. I was going to try to write a book about our sort of deeper cultural interest in extraterrestrial intelligence. This book is like at the forefront of that. And this was many years ago, and I was invited to visit the chateau. It's in Normandy, the Chateau de la Messenguer, and then I didn't hear anything from the owners. And it turns out they were going through a divorce. And I was like, my God, I've come all the way to see this place. I at least have to drive there. So my wife and I drive there, and I can see from outside nobody's home. I'm not proud of this fact, but I climbed the fence, and I walked around the back of the chateau where Fontenelle and the widow of the chateau's owner at the time, this Marquis, he doesn't give her a name, uh, walk every evening and talk about space and talk about the cosmos. And it was actually really magical. It's a beautiful day, and there are these statues of the Greek gods and in this chateau. So and then I ran away pretty quickly, realizing what I had done. So uh, I don't know about the statute of limitations on that, so please don't turn me into the French police. And I don't speak French. My wife does, so it would have been a difficult conversation. Anyway, so Fontenelle is there writing this fictionalized dialogue with the Marquis. It's not a stretch to think that these two real life figures were lovers. There's a lot of flirtation in this book, as it turns out. The evenings are delicious, they say. You know, they walk out into the garden and there's the moon rising, all quite romantic. And she says this, or he says this to her. He says, "The moon turns around the earth and never leaves her in the circle the earth makes around the sun. If she moves around the sun, it's only because she won't leave the earth." And the Marquis responds, "I understand and I love the moon for staying with us when all the other planets abandoned us." Really gorgeous stuff. It's a really beautiful book. It's not long. I highly recommend it. It holds up well, just like Galileo's Starry Messenger. So Fontenelle goes on to explain the moon. Why we only see one side, where its light comes from, right? It's reflecting light from the sun. And he has this sort of orbital epiphany where he imagines being up there looking down, and he sees all the different faces of the moon: white, black, tawny, and olive. There are hats and turbans and woolly heads and shaved heads, cities with bell towers, cities with spires and crescents. It's a gorgeous, imaginative voyage seeing the Earth from the moon. And he says, of course, that every day now, since we are well into the age of the telescope, our learned men travel to the moon every day with their telescopes. So he tries to describe what he thinks is there. And he is pretty certain that there are lakes and oceans, that the Maria, those areas that are darker, sort of lava, as we know now, are in fact oceans. This is something that is a motif through all of this work, whether it's sort of fictional lunar voyages or natural history, that there would be air and water on the moon. We'll come to find out, right, that's not the case. But the Marquis is like delighted. It's like, oh my God, then there must be life on the moon if there's water there and air, and there's landscape, there are mountains and valleys. But then he backtracks, and this is where I think it's really interesting. He's sort of applying skepticism to his own imaginary lunar voyage, and he says that the moon is quite rocky, it could be desiccated, and it might have a little bit of air, or dews, as he calls them, or vapors, a little different from our vapors. And he says this, he says, if that's the case, you need an active core. You need active geology on the moon. Like, that is really prescient. Okay, this is like 1686. He's saying this. He says we need the interior motion of the moon's parts, uh, or anything producing external causes that would make the world of the moon dynamic like ours. If that's the case, there's a chance for fruit and grain and water and lunar beings, he says, about whom I don't know anything. So the possible lack of water is not a hindrance. And he even invokes the microscope here, because they had found little tiny creatures right inside rocks that are chewing on the crystals and grains in the rocks. So that may be happening on the moon as well. I think this is the first reference to endoliths, rock, lith, love, rock loving creatures on other worlds. So Fontenelle is just an incredibly important person. This work, Conversations on the Plurality of Worlds, really looms over the cultural imaginary into the 19th century. So speaking of the 19th century, let's take a leap. We're going to skip a lot of these other lunar voyages. And we get to a point where the astronomers are largely convinced that there is no air, and they also, can take measurements here on Earth, seeing that the moon is really hot when the sun is out and really cold when it's not. So this dream of life on the moon, as part of the proto science fiction of lunar voyages, really begins to fade. That brings us to Jules Verne and H.G. Wells in the late 19th and early 20th century, the two most important imaginary lunar voyages, really, since Lucian, since Kepler. Verne there with the big bushy beard, Wells with just the mustache and sort of wry look. It's actually those photographs, I think, capture their personalities really well. Verne was quite serious about his work. I am not a huge fan. I describe his work as blueprints with verbs. They're very engaged in describing, sort of the technological things that he's working on, like the submarine, the Nautilus, or what have you. Wells, who was huge, huge, influential, a global superstar in his day in the late 19th century into at least the 1920s, gives us that sort of glinting, wry look there. And it's Wells who gives us the last brilliant depiction of lunar life. And I'll just go here for a few more minutes, but I just want to share this with you. This was from his 1901 novel, First Men in the Moon. It's a terrific book. I won't get into the plot, but they get there. The travelers get there, and they witness dawn on the moon, and it's a really a gorgeous passage. So the poet T.S. Eliot was like deeply impressed by Wells's description here. So here's just part of it. They're inside their capsule, so they're looking through some thick glass, as you'll hear in the end. So this is what he says: Imagine it, imagine that dawn, the resurrection of the frozen air, the stirring and quickening of the soil, and then this silent uprising of vegetation, this unearthly ascent of fleshiness and spikes. Conceive it all lit by a blaze that would make the intensest sunlight of earth seem watery and weak. And still amidst this stirring jungle, and still amidst the stirring jungle, wherever there was a shadow, lingered banks of bluish snow. And to have the picture of our impression complete, you must bear in mind that we saw it all through a thick bent glass, distorting it as things are distorted by a lens, acute only in the center of the picture, and very bright there, and toward the edges, magnified and unreal. So he goes on, his crew of lunar astronauts go on to have adventures there. There is a lunar civilization that is living underground, and again, there's a lot of sort of social commentary about the future of the human species, about the relationship of the intellect to the body, and about sort of self-government, how we organize our societies. It's a terrific book, but it's Verne in he wrote From the Earth to the Moon and Around the Moon, but often we just call it From Earth to the Moon. He's the one who sort of really gets it, surprisingly to me, because of, he's not as interesting a writer as Verne. But this is just a brief passage of what his crew sees as they go around in the Columbiad, their capsule around the moon, which was launched by a cannon from Florida. So prescient there. This is what Verne says about the moon. The sight of this desolate world did not fail to captivate by its very strangeness. Watching heights defile under their feet, piercing the cavities with their eyes, going down into the rifts, climbing the ramparts, sounding these mysterious holes, the craters, and leveling all cracks. But no trace of vegetation, no appearance of cities, nothing but stratification, beds of lava, overflowings polished like immense mirrors, reflecting the sun's rays with overpowering brilliancy, nothing belonging to the living world, everything to a dead world, where avalanches rolling from the summits of the mountains would disperse noiselessly at the bottom of an abyss, retaining the motion but wanting the sound. In any case, it was the image of death, without its being possible even to say that life had ever existed there. Bang. So he is closing the book on these long tradition of lunar voyages to a living moon. So I'm going to wrap up here, bringing us up into the 20th century pretty quickly. Arthur C. Clarke, Robert Heinlein, both wrote stories in the 20th century, the sort of golden age of science fiction. There are other lunar stories in the 1920s and 30s, and I'll show you a book that has some of those. Those are largely forgotten. But Robert Heinlein's story, Requiem. Now, Heinlein, if you know him, he's not a writer known particularly well for like emotional intelligence, but this is actually a really beautiful little story about a businessman I don't know. We could update this perhaps. He would be a billionaire now, who's dying, and he tricks these two space pilots to take him to the moon so he could die on the surface of the moon. So that is his story, Requiem. He goes on to write "The Moon is a Harsh Mistress," a famous novel from 1966 about a lunar penal colony that revolts against the Earth and his more traditional Heinlein themes of libertarianism and anarchism. Another story from the golden age of science fiction, 1940s, 1950s, Arthur C. Clarke's The Sentinel, which you may know is one of the origins of Stanley Kubrick and Clarke's collaboration for 2001. The Sentinel is a very short story in which you're on the moon. It's a very domestic scene. It opens with a fellow, of course, a fellow scrambling his bacon in a little, lunar rover tractor. So you're having coffee and bacon, you're on the moon. It's this very domestic scene, and they see this little thing in the distance. It turns out to be a pyramid from another culture, an alien culture. Clarke, of course, turns it into the famous obelisk from 2001. Collier's Magazine is a really important cultural touchstone. Walt Disney, Wernher von Braun is the rocket engineers collaborating with both of those to popularize the idea of lunar voyages and trying to get us there as soon as possible. These are some stills from Destination Moon, which actually Robert Heinlein wrote the screenplay for. He disliked what happened to it, so if you watch it, and I recommend it, it's going to be very campy now. It was quite earnest in its day in 1951. It won an Academy Award for special effects. But anyway, Heinlein did not like the script, and I think the credit goes to Rip von Wonkel or something silly like that. So you can see the astronauts here. What you can't see is that they're claiming the moon for the United States of America, which also happens in a Simpsons clip that I don't have time to share with you. This is Chesley Bonestell. He is who also was involved in the set design here for the moon. You see these craggy peaks. Craggy peaks are not part of what the lunar landscape looks like, but it was part of this sort of imagined voyage to the moon, even into the space age. But by the space age, Apollo catches up with science fiction, and you can watch interviews with science fiction writers of that time, Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, saying, well, the moon is done for now. Like we don't have anything else to say. Like we've gotten there. I will say in closing, J.G. Ballard in 1985 writes a short story called The Man Who Walked on the Moon, which I would recommend to you. Ballard is one of my favorite writers. And it is a sort of internal voyage. The narrator describes a man who claims to have been an Apollo astronaut, who claims to have walked on the moon. And it turns out he's just a grifter. He's a con man. It's like the seaside tropical town, and the tourists come to talk to him and give him money and so forth. And so it becomes an internal exploration of what the moon means to us. So I include that story by J.G. Ballard, The Man Who Walked on the Moon, as a kind of commentary, sort of internalizing this tradition of imagined lunar voyages to sort of make it like, why the obsession? Why are we thinking so hard about this? So from the second century to the early 20th century, we have these imagined voyages and dreams of life and social commentary, adventure and science. And then we have this move to space-suited explorers and entrepreneurs. Reality is no longer science fictional once we have Apollo, but now we have this new lunar revival, which is sending us to the moon for resources, for water ice, and we have some unsettling views of what the moon might look like. I know Erica's going to talk about that. So, what of the moon itself? That is a question we can discuss, and I can put this in the chat actually, so you can have this as Erica's talking as well. Some suggested readings. I will stop there and hand the floor over to my friend and colleague Erica Newsfold. So, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. It was a very interesting, very open-minded presentation. It really was very rich of information. And now it's Erica's turn. She will talk about today's lunar stories, tomorrow's lunar challenges. Please, Erica, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm assuming you can see my slides, but not my notes, which is always my biggest fear. Um, Thank you, Chris, for that great presentation. That's what I wrote in my notes, knowing that it would be, of course. Um, as mentioned, I'm an astrophysicist, but I write and work on um, questions of space ethics, particularly when it comes to space settlement. And while I've been a lifelong fan of science fiction, I'm not, I would say, academically a student of film and literature, but I am someone who thinks a lot about the rhetoric in today's space industry and space advocacy groups and among the public about what we're going to do in space. And so I think a lot about how science fiction influences that public conception and vice versa. So I'm going to pick up essentially where Christopher left off. I'll talk a little bit. I'll make a couple of references to the so-called golden age of science fiction literature, but I'm really going to focus on very recent sci-fi film and television series. And I want to pick up where we left off with, I think Christopher quoted what's it, Arthur C. Clarke, who said essentially we're done with the moon now. We've been there. There's nothing else to say about it, which was perhaps a common unspoken feeling after Apollo. But through looking into a lot of the recent science fiction about the moon, most of what I do has to do with Mars, so this was a fun change for me. I found I've identified themes going beyond just imagining voyages to the moon. Now that we've been there, we've done that. How do we what do we think about the moon now, and how does that appear in the stories that we tell? One theme that I'll just start with is this idea in these stories of the moon as a threat. So this is a classic sci-fi trope. There's this big bright ball of rock hanging over our heads every night. What if it tries to kill us? There's plenty of movies, TV shows, books from the past few decades that depict the moon as some kind of threat, either because it hides a threat or because it physically poses a threat to us. So here I'm showing a screenshot from a 2022 disaster sci-fi film called Moonfall. And in this, it's both hiding a threat and it's a threat itself. The heroes of this film are investigating a change to the moon's orbit and discover that it's actually this hollow, artificially constructed mega structure that's essentially out to get us. So this trope of the moon hiding something advanced and nefarious is perfect for a sci-fi horror story in particular. It plays on the fact that the moon's always there, and we often take it for granted. Just like horror movies put the monster in something that otherwise you would trust or love, your dog, your family, your house. We take the moon for granted. Our cultural feelings towards the moon range from neutral indifference to curiosity to aesthetic appreciation to maybe even affection. And so that makes it the perfect place for a horror story to have some sort of evil lurking right in our backyard. So in these examples, I've mentioned Moonfall, but also there's a couple very popular and less popular classic movies. Called one that I'll mention is Apollo 18, but also Transformers: Dark Side of the Moon, one of the Transformers films. In these examples, the moon is used as a hiding place for alien or, in the case of Moonfall, robotic threats, which emerge specifically after the humans start to explore and trigger a reaction. So there's a bit of that, if we explore too much, we risk making something dangerous aware of our presence. And that this is a common thing in sci-fi horror about space and about exploration in general. But the moon itself can also be portrayed as an intrinsic threat by itself. This can be through some sort of natural catastrophe, or the moon can be harnessed as a weapon. And again, this is taking something that feels comfortable and normal, and we take it for granted, and turns it into a cause for destruction. So a couple of examples that I do recommend. Neil Stephenson's popular book from a few years ago called Seven Eves starts with the moon being broken up into 7 large pieces. For some unknown reason, the pieces start to collide and fall out of the sky, and eventually this causes an extinction level event on Earth. In the television world, there's a television show called The Umbrella Academy that's adapted from a comic book series. And at the end of season 1 of The Umbrella Academy, the moon is similarly exploded by a beam of energy that shoots out of a magical violin. Don't worry about it, it's a comic book series. But this causes a similar end of the world disaster and some beautiful CGI. So this idea of a mad scientist or an evil alien who wants to blow up the moon is a trope, a well-known cliche in superhero fiction in particular. I'm sadly not a student of comic book lore at all. So the earliest example I could find looking at films was the 1980 film, the Flash Gordon movie that's got someone wanting to use the moon against us. But one of my favorite takes on this kind of idea of the moon as a physical threat is stories that explore what kind of disaster to the Earth would result if we lost our moon. Since, again, we take it for granted, especially the role it plays in things like our tides or stabilizing our orbit. So I highly recommend the multiple award-winning trilogy by N.K. Jemisin called, the trilogy is called Broken Earth. It starts with the 5th season. And small spoiler, involves the absence of the moon because it's been put on a highly elliptical orbit and it's just causing chaos on Earth. Aside from these great sci-fi horror ideas, there's certainly a number of science fiction stories, as Christopher mentioned, that feature the moon as a source of some kind of valuable resource. And this is, of course, non-fictional as well. A lot of people who are motivated to returns to the moon, especially on the private side and commercial side, want to do it for resource extraction purposes. So this is a screenshot from the excellent 2009 film Moon, which Christopher mentioned, illustrating probably the first thing you think of when I mention resources, which is lunar mining. This is just an establishing shot that plays for a few seconds during the film, and you can see on the right there strip mining on the surface of the moon as the mining companies work to extract valuable resources. So most of these stories really just feature a lunar mine as a setting more than anything, or just an indicator in the story that this version of humanity is more advanced in spacefaring than we are today. But they often, to me, the interesting ones include depictions of the same kinds of conflicts and issues that we struggle with in the mining industry here on Earth today. Environmental damage, strip mining the moon and leaving scars, labor exploitation, and the sort of high stakes economic competition you get with something extremely valuable like presumably lunar resources. So some examples that I took some screenshots from. This is an episode late in the series Star Trek Enterprise. All of these examples I'll show at the top usually get some establishing shot with a bunch of classic domes and mining equipment and stuff. But in this episode, when you go inside the mine and they're doing an establishing shot of the unnamed characters who are miners, they are not very Star Trek-like. They're grubby, they're using space lasers, but they're also pushing around carts full of presumably foam rocks through this dirty mine. And so this is an almost cartoonishly direct reference to terrestrial mining and the impact it has on labor. In the film that I mentioned before, Moon, which includes the exact same photo of the moon, of the Earth from the moon that I have on my wall there, you get this high-tech facility, high-tech rovers. He's even got a robot, a speaking robot friend. But the corporation that is employing Sam Rockwell's character is using a separate sci-fi trope to exploit him as a worker, to the point that he is the workers in this space mine are threatened with physical harm and health impacts, and essentially are never going to go home, even though they promised that they would be. Again, echoing the sort of labor exploitation that we see and have historically seen in the mining industry here on Earth. Another example is Ad Astra from a few years ago, 2019, I think. Brad Pitt's character is headed for the outer solar system, but he makes a brief stop on the moon, which has a number of lunar mines and escalators and very normal looking things, shiny lunar rovers, but also has disputed mining territories and pirates attacking other rovers, which you can see in this screenshot here. So a lot of what we see when we're looking at stories about lunar mining are, as good science fiction does, parallels to issues that we have historically and currently struggle with here on Earth, in this case with resource extraction. Speaking of disputed territory, the moon is also frequently depicted as a valuable resource due to its location, even more than its specific mining resources. It's not just aliens hiding on the moon, as I mentioned in the first section. There are a surprising number of stories where Nazis, defeated just before the start of the space age, have been hiding out on some secret moon base ever since. So here we've got Heinlein's young adult adventure rocket ship Galileo, where a few young men go to the moon and find some hiding Nazis. A film that Christopher recommended to me when we were chatting about this talk called Iron Sky, which is a sort of sci-fi satire from 2012. Again, Nazis hiding out on the moon. Philip K. Dick's novel, The Man in the High Castle, which has been adapted into a television series, shows an alternate history where the Nazis won World War II. They're not hiding on the moon. They were just, because they won, they were the first to land on the moon and then colonize Mars and I think Venus. And so they subvert the classic image of the Apollo astronauts with the American flag on the moon with this. And in almost exactly the same shot in the alternate history TV series For All Mankind. This is sorry, I forgot to mention, I highly recommend, I came across this great Vice article talking about Nazis on the moon from about 10 years ago. So it actually doesn't include Man in the High Castle, but I highly recommend it. But moving away from Nazis momentarily, the For All Mankind's alternate history imagines that the Soviet Union wins the race to put a man on the moon, beating the Apollo program. This kicks off a prolonged race for further development on the lunar surface. And you can see here they're doing that same subversion of the flag, this time with the USSR flag. And then science fiction set even farther in the future, as in The Expanse, similarly imagine competition for territory and resources in space long after our current national borders have become obsolete. So in The Expanse, it's the united peoples of the Earth, Moon, Mars, and the outer solar system are fighting for resources and territory. But I would say the most common trope that you see, the most common imagining of the moon in science fiction is just people live there now. That's what makes it science fiction. So the moon as a home. This is from The Expanse, as I just mentioned. Mostly this is about colonization of the moon. And in general, when we're talking about science fiction about space colonization, stories about lunar colonies are usually using a lunar city to as not the frontier. So usually the colony that you see in a moon in science fiction is a well-established settlement, well-developed, right in Earth's backyard, and used to show that humans in this story have been doing this for a while and the frontiers farther out in space. And so this includes The Expanse. This is Level City from The Expanse, as I just showed. This includes Ad Astra, which I showed before. Again, the frontiers farther out in the solar system in Ad Astra, and Star Trek, etc. Essentially, all of these stories set in a far but realistic future where humanity has colonized the solar system. We almost inevitably have some sort of major city, not just a base, but a city on the moon. There are other types of stories that imagine people living on the moon. Some of them, I would say, imagine the moon as a lifeboat or a refuge of some kind. This ties into real life advocacy about the moon. A lot of space settlement advocates argue that we should be going to space to avoid an existential threat to the human species. We may need to go live in space if something makes the Earth uninhabitable. The moon is technically our closest option for solid ground if we don't just want to live in space stations. Mars is usually more popular as a place where we would all flee to in these stories. But there are a few examples. This screenshot's from The Expanse, where everything's already settled, but there's an attack on Earth and the people on the moon in the moon city are watching horrified as the Earth is attacked. Dipping back into Arthur C. Clarke, he has a story called If I Forget Thee, O Earth, which is just a nice little story about a young boy growing up on the moon, being taken to the surface and shown the Earth, which has been rendered glowingly, radioactively uninhabitable, but he hopes that his descendants may one day be able to return. And of course, Christopher spoiled this one for me already. There's this idea of the moon as a prison. Because it's so close, I think the moon is often used as a sort of space Australia, where we could send all of our um, convicts and imprison them, because it's much harder to escape from a space prison from the moon than it would be even from Australia or Alcatraz, whatnot. Heinlein's novel, Moon is the Harsh Mistress, which was mentioned earlier, is one of the most famous examples of this. Heinlein's characters in this book end up, as mentioned, overthrowing their jailers and establishing a libertarian utopia, because it's a Heinlein book. But there are a number of stories about space prisons and the idea of space prisons being inescapable, but also carrying the same issues that we have from prisons here on Earth into space in the future. If you're interested in the topic of space prisons in science fiction, I have a chapter out in a volume called Crime, Criminal Justice, and Ethics in Outer Space, and I got to cite a whole bunch of science fiction portrayals of space prisons, not just on the moon, but beyond. So what's the common theme here that we see in these stories, especially like what can we see in these themes that might suggest a real life concern? Certainly this idea of the moon as a threat reminds us that, as Christopher mentioned, the moon and the Earth are a system together, and they, in some ways, can be considered a shared environment. A threat to the moon would be a threat to Earth's environment as well, and also a threat to the moon is something we should consider a bad thing for its own sake, for the moon's sake. We need to remember that exploitation of the moon's resources will probably follow the same patterns of our exploitation of Earth's resources, unless we're very intentional about learning from history, about learning from these stories that we tell each other. And the moon is an objectively worse place to live than the Earth is. And when we get there, we'll be bringing all of our societal or social problems with us. And so it's not going to magically solve all of our problems, which makes for great stories, but is also maybe not going to make for a great place to live unless, again, we're deliberate about being aware of these problems. So practically, what can we learn from these themes that I've been mentioning that appear over and over again, especially in our modern stories about the moon? Public messaging, as I said, is something I think about a lot. A lot of the messages that the public has been receiving about space settlement have been from advocates who are trying to get investments or fight against regulation. And they are things that I think we need to science fiction is surprisingly sometimes more grounded and realistic in their vision of the future, of our future on the moon, than the marketing hype is, because it's marketing hype. It's not meant to be realistic. And so it's important, I think, to convey these realistic concerns to the public. For example, space, the moon in particular, is not a blank slate where we can just create a utopia with no effort. We'll bring all our problems with us. We need to make sure we're bringing solutions as well. Lunar resources are not infinite. This is the idea of space being infinite and therefore providing infinite wealth is a great thing to tell your potential investors, but the resources we can actually reach and utilize and perhaps share with each other, especially on the moon, not infinite. What does this mean in terms of policy priorities? Christopher mentioned, asking how these tie into current policy battles. Environmental protection, probably nothing we're going to do to the moon in the near future is going to harm it so much that it changes the tides or the Earth's orbit. But we need to start thinking about the moon, the lunar surface, as an environment that deserves protection and especially precautionary forethought. Labor rights, labor protections is very important. It's sometimes hard for people to imagine why we'd need labor rights, because at the moment we venerate astronauts. If Artemis manages to get people back to the moon, everyone will know those people's names. We cheer for them. But if you look at these stories, you can see the science fiction writers imagining what happens when we have so many people living and working in space that they turn from venerated astronauts into blue-collar workers who are being put at risk and exploited. And how can we make sure we're protecting them through regulation? And of course, everybody knows this, but it's worth saying we need to focus on international cooperation, because the risk of territorial competition in space would be deadly. And just keep of all the research that we're doing, one thread that I think is important to pursue is to ask, what can our history here on Earth and the parallels of all of these efforts here on Earth teach us about our lunar future, so that we're not just repeating the same mistakes of the past? And I'll just stop there so we can get some questions in.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you for your just great lecture. And before going the floor to giving the floor to Lisa, I would like to ask Giuseppe Reibaldi, who's the chairman of the Moon Village Association, to say a few words. Please, Giuseppe.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you to all of you, Chris, Erica, Lisa, Raymond, for this great event. The Cultural Working Group is really one of our shining example of how to operate for the working group. We will be trying very hard this year to increase the participation because the work that you guys have been doing is really great. And I mean, I follow some of them, others I watch on the YouTube channel. So I think coming to today, this is really fundamental because Artemis 2 is on the launch pad. And so many of us can use many of this information. All of us have been asked to give a presentation these days all over the places because of the Artemis 2. So thank you for giving this interesting background information. Just another talk, and then I'll make some more serious consideration. Just for your information, for me, the start of my interest for the moon is related to when I was 9 years old, and I wrote a science fiction novel called Arrival to the Moon, on the Moon. So this is the official starting date of my interest for the moon, 9 years old. So it's not interesting. So it's not listed within your let's say information, but I know it and I still keep the novel. Now coming to the more serious point, I think particularly also Erica has last many of the things which you said, and of course also Chris in his history. This is really the butter and the heart of our activities. So I think United Nations and many of the activities Erica has mentioned, from the environmental issues to the policy issues, and that's why basically the Moon Village as a concept is really aiming by definition to have multi-stakeholder, which hopefully, and we are trying to do our best with our, say, small contribution as an association, thanks also to you, really to try to bring people from different culture and different attitude to discuss on different topics. And so we, as you know, conduct what's so-called track 2 discussions, while United Nations, of course, conduct rightfully so track 1 discussion. So I think all of this discussion which is happening within the MVA, thanks to you and other people, are really important. And you can see also from the list of our participants today, they are from all over the world. And so I hope they will have some interesting question. But I think what I heard is extremely interesting, even for me, which, as I said, I started a few years ago. And again, thank you so much. And hopefully we will have other events similar. What is the reality is catching up, as Clark, who I had the pleasure to meet personally a few years ago, was indicating that it was the end of the story. That's not completely correct. I think we are now going for simulation of what might happen on the moon. And the simulation in the past was called science fiction. Now it's called simulation. But that is really happening right now. So again, thank you so much, and for all your great work, and looking forward, of course, to continue to our collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you, Giuseppe. Lisa, please go ahead.
Great. Well, thank you, Giuseppe. We're hoping to keep this rolling. There seem to be an endless number of subjects to talk about. It's just a question of research and time and enthusiasm, really. So thinking about both of your presentations, Chris and Erica, I couldn't help but think how science fiction will emerge after we get to the moon and we have some experience of living there, and we start to, it's a bit like climbing a mountain. When you get to the top, you see something else. And I wonder where and how useful will it be, science fiction, that, you know, applying imagination like that to storytelling, how that might, what direction might that go? I mean, I have secret desire that it will continue to show us a better, more utopian way to live. It can always be this place where we can look at, reflect back on what we've done and say, okay, this is a place where we can start to put it together properly.
I think that long after we are living more permanently on the moon, we'll keep writing stories about living on the moon. I think we'll just stop calling it science fiction at some point.
Right.
Those will be political thrillers and romance novels and things like that. But that won't stop us writing science fiction about going further or about developing new technologies. I don't think the moon is an especially good candidate for terraforming, but I think if we ever get to the point where we're living someplace like Mars, and terraforming is still a massively impossible undertaking, but potentially someday possible, that the people living there will dream about what Mars might look like in the future with science fiction technologies. So that's something I think we'll see as well.
I agree. Yeah, we take culture with us. So Al Warden came back from circling the moon in Apollo 15 to write poetry, and so I look forward to, I hope in my lifetime, maybe there's an Artemis base camp at the South Pole, maybe just doing science before we get into the giant mess that we need to try to untangle with commerce. But yes, we'll continue to tell those stories, and I just sort of related to that. I think one of the things that I hope one would see with the astronauts and the taikonauts who get there is a greater emphasis on, and this is tying to this notion of the environmental protection of the moon, and there's a lot to untangle there because there is no indigenous life there, but conveying the beauty of the moon. And one of the things that I talk ceaselessly about is how Apollo 8 did a disservice to the description of the moon. And instead when Apollo 15 and the later crews get there, they're moved by the beauty of the moon and the sublime wonder of the moon. And that science fiction has failed to do that as well. I was looking through a number of texts and just not finding that kind of moving description of the beauty of the moon, of the moon's landscapes, the kind of thing that you would find in nature writing or environmental writing about a particular place, the Lake District or the Alps or the American West. And so that there's a great blank slate there. I don't want to go on too long, but I do also want to say that if you want a more positive sort of, not quite utopian, but sort of a positive take on a lunar future, Kim Stanley Robinson's novel Red Moon is the book I think to read right now. There's a protagonist he gets framed for a crime. It's an international group of people on the moon, largely Chinese, but there's a revolution that is getting underway. Heinlein would not have liked the particular approach of this revolution, but Red Moon is a novel worth reading, I think, right now.
Great. So is there anybody in the audience that wants to pose a question? It can be in the chat. We also have a Q&A button, which is along the bottom there. Are we muted, everybody in general? I don't know if Glafke has us all muted, or whether audience can talk or not. And you could just pipe up if you want to say something.
There is a question there in the Q&A.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh yeah, here we go. So it says, thanks, Camille. Could you describe to us how the idea of space resources has changed in science fiction? Is this Chilowski wrote about? Yeah, wrote about gemstones from the moon. Other works discussed gold, while at some point the focus shifted to industrial materials. What is your take on it?
That's a great observation. And I think that the idea that so many early science fiction authors tried to figure out what sort of gemstones or gold we could get there is just a reflection of the colonization mindset that if you can literally see new territory for a lot of cultures, the dominant cultures in recent history, the first thing to think is, how can I make money off of that? We're still having that approach, but we know more about the moon. Because we've done more analysis, a big part of the space mining economy is the question of what can you extract from space that you can then sell back to Earth? And they haven't really answered that question. There's not gemstones or gold on the moon. There's some talk of rare earth elements in asteroids and things like that. But what is really ramping up is the idea of, okay, we can't sell stuff back to Earth. What can we extract from the moon that we can sell to other people who are living in space? And that includes things like helium-3, if we can optimize using it as a fuel, but in particular water, which we can use both as a fuel and avoid having to ship it up from Earth. And so I think that evolution that you see from gems and gold to helium-3 and water is partly about figuring out what's actually on the moon, but also figuring out what the customer base is. And at the moment, the customer base that people seem to be relying on is other people living in space.
I would just add to Erica's cogent comment there that too, it's like, I think we're so used to talking about this now that let's just remember how incredibly hard this is going to be. And it may be so hard that what we have happening on the moon is more like the South Pole Station of Antarctica or McMurdo Base, where it is largely supported from outside and is largely a scientific establishment. And my secret hope is that is what it turns out to be, because just see how hard it is to get the Space Launch System off the ground, right? Because hydrogen is such a tricky molecule. So this is going to take decades, I think.
Well, and hard means expensive. So
yeah, exactly.
How fast we do it will also depend. If we're going to do it with a big commercial component, it's going to depend on if they can crack the business case of it, which I don't think they have yet.
Well, my hope is that they'll actually start manufacturing, or they'll be hand making things on the moon itself. So this will be a fantastic activity for the inhabitants, is to make their own pottery, etc., and find some way to. This could actually become, I mean, those would be amazing souvenirs, a moon dust plate,
I was going to say earlier,
we sintered or something.
We don't just need science fiction writers to be living on the moon. We need poets and painters, landscape painters, and also potters.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, we have another question here. From Julie. Fantastic. So thank you both for fabulous presentations. Have either of you seen any evidence of leadership at commercial space ventures engaging with science fiction, especially in a way that might indicate they're picking up these important positive ideas? This is probably an overly hopeful question. Would either of you like to take that on?
I don't know.
You go ahead, Chris. I've been going first.
No, I have. My only thought there is that a lot of these guys, mostly guys, are inspired by science fiction, but are extremely superficial consumers of it. And so the kinds of lessons that we both have been talking about here are still largely to be processed. But that's just that totally external observation. I'm not talking with the CEO of Relativity Space or anything like that. But it would be nice if we could get them on one of these webinars and have a discussion. But yeah, Erica.
I actually agree with Chris here. There's sort of a fascinating effect that has been talked about more and more. A lot of people assume that because science fiction can make such fascinating commentary about human nature and societal problems, that everyone gets the same message out of those science fiction stories, but that's not the case. And there is a famous tweet that I've pulled up so I can read, which captures this perfectly, back from the days when Twitter was good, by someone named Alex Blechman. Tweet: Sci-Fi author, in my book, I invented the torment nexus as a cautionary tale. Tech company, at long last, we have created the torment nexus from the classic sci-fi novel, Don't Create the Torment Nexus. And so the torment nexus has become shorthand in these conversations for this, again, shallow reading of science fiction. I'm not a snob about literary analysis, but the number of a certain type of person who reads these science fiction stories and goes, oh, a prison on the moon, that's a great idea, instead of following the story through and looking at the effects of that technology technology is overrepresented in the tech industry at the moment. And so what often I make a point to say in these conversations about science fiction and space settlement is that you can't just assume that everyone's getting the same message out of these stories. Stories can be, science fiction can be cultural touchstones, but not everyone interprets them the same way. And sometimes people will end up taking the opposite message from something.
So we've got another question here. Another question from Camille. Does the Torment Nexus argument take into account that some sci-fi nerds are just the space equivalent of I love trains people?
In defense of I love trains people, some of them are lovely people. But I think what you're identifying here is that some people read science fiction for the cool technology and maybe its implications for society as a whole, and other people read it for the characters and the effects on individual people, and they imagine themselves living in such a world. And you could argue that's the difference between hard sci-fi and not hard science fiction, but I like science fiction that has both. But yeah, there's so much happening in science fiction beyond just the technological proposal. But some people are just there for the technology idea. It's true.
Yeah, I would agree, Erica. And I think there's a reason why Heinlein has come up several times. You know, he's very important figure in the history of science fiction, the canon of science fiction. To read his prose today, it's wooden, it's clunky. He doesn't do character very well. These things that a lot of us would value, but because of his technological sort of interests and his sort of, I would call, right libertarian kind of neo anarchism sort of government mindset, he's really popular. Okay. And so you put that against, say, you know, Kim Stanley Robinson's an enormously popular writer. It'd be interesting to put a couple of those novels in if we could get I don't know, Jeff Caloris, who's at Blue Origin, the Vice President of Lunar Permanence. That's his title. I'd love to set these two novels in front of him and say, what do you think? You know, so.
The tech industry, and thus the private space industry, which is a subset of that, or at least related to it, has a lot of a particular ideology of techno-utopianism, techno-idealism, which, to really oversimplify it, is people who believe that technology can fix our problems, including our social problems, which is not the case. You have to figure out how the technology will be used, how it will be distributed equitably and fairly, et cetera. But the idea that you can just invent the technology and don't have to worry about the social implications, I think, is also where a lot of this comes from.
Yes. So are there any other questions from other people still here?
Maybe I have a small question for Chris. Have you ever bumped into an Italian poem from a 16th century Italian poet named Ludovico Ariosto? The poem name, the poem title is Orlando Furioso, Raging Orlando, where Orlando becomes crazy in love for Angelica, and his brain migrates to the moon.
Yeah.
And then it is recovered by a friend of his who rode a magic horse and recovered the brain and brought it back to Orlando.
Yeah. I know I have read excerpts from the poem, but I have not read the poem in its entirety. It's one of my gaps.
Yeah, sure.
And so I have put that down as to add to the reading list. But I also to speak of this is sort of off to the side, but also related to science fiction. Remo, you related your you're interested in, say, writers like Ray Bradbury, and the Italian writer, somewhat controversial now for other reasons, but Oriana Fallaci wrote a beautiful book called If the Sun Dies, which is a chronicle of NASA and the space age and early Apollo astronauts. She invokes science fiction a lot in that book. So I recommend, at least in the, from the English translation, I recommend that book to see how a mind who is a little more humanistic, a little more receptive, a little more social, is receiving science fiction in the context of that technological optimism that Erica has talked about.
Mm. It'd be great if you could put the title in the chat here. If you can do that down there.
So my chat, Lisa, I'm only getting hosts and panelists. So if somebody can, I sent the bibliography over there.
Yeah, that's come through. Yeah.
If you can share that with the audience. For some reason, I can't get the audience up for chat.
Okay. Yeah. So what was the name of the book again?
I will. Yes, it's called If the Sun Dies, and I'll send this by chat to the panelists, by Oriana Fallaci. And then I have the other books that I mentioned and have the slide for at the end, and people can reach out to me too and share that. But while you're doing that, I also want to recommend, it's those of us of a certain age will remember a couple seasons of a fairly terrible but wonderful show called Space 1999, which where the moon is blasted. It's a dump for nuclear waste, and the nuclear waste explodes and the moon is ripped out of orbit. Fairly absurd, but worth watching.
Right.
I remember.
I did, Remo, I did see a wonderful etching that must have been an illustration for that poetry, the book, the Orlando story. It really is fantastic. I used it in a presentation before, and I'd never seen it or heard of it, but I just thought it was What was it? Furioso Orlando or Orlando
Yes,
Furioso?
Orlando Furioso. It is translated usually Raging Orlando.
Okay. Great. Okay.
Okay. Thank you all. It was a very interesting webinar, and I want to thank both Chris and Erica for their presentations. And I want to thank especially now Lisa, because her help, the help from her was really great in these years. And she still stays together with us, but not in the role of chair, of a co-chair. Thank you, Lisa. It was really a great help that I had.
Great collaboration, Remo. It's been fun. I've learned a lot. a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you
care.
all. Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.